Hey, Jonathan here at the Colfax High Wood Shop. Today I'm going to talk about handheld routers, the difference between a plunge router and a regular router. I have a battery operated router, safe procedures. So we're going to learn all about handheld routers before we go over the router tables and the CNC router. So stay tuned for a video on handheld routers. About handheld routers today. They're really cool tools with a lot of applications, and all the CNC equipment in the shop is really just a handheld router mounted on a gantry. So there's primarily two different types of routers. This is a standard router here. This is a fixed base router. And the reason why it's called a fixed base is that you set the cutter height right here, how deep it comes through the base, and you set it and it's fixed and it doesn't move at all. So this is a fixed router, a fixed base router. Porter Cable is one of the larger router manufacturers, a really high quality manufacturer. And then this right here is called a plunge router, and it is not a fixed base. And the reason why you use a plunge router is so that you can put it on top of a board, and then you could loosen this up and then plunge down into the wood. So this is a plunge router. That's a fixed base router. They're almost always corded. And then it's a really high speed motor. The motor's probably spinning at 20,000 RPMs. And usually there's some sort of variable speed on the motor or a speed setting on the motor. So besides them being corded, they just started making battery operated routers as well. So this is kind of like a little mini router, and you can see the speed settings on the side right here. And then as far as router bits go, I mean, there's an unbelievable assortment of cutters you could use or bits. I have two different blocks right here. These are all for a 1/4 inch collet, so they have a 1/4 inch diameter, and these are all non-bearing bits. So you have to either freehand it or use a fence or some sort of guide to move the router with these kinds of bits. And just, I'll go over some of these. This is a 1/4 inch 2-flute flat end mill. This is a 1/2 inch 2-flute flat end mill. This is a little 1/4 inch ball end mill, flat end mill. These are T cutters right here. So you could cut like they call it a keyhole slot. So you plunge into the wood and run, and you could hang a screw on that or use it as a track. This is a Dovetail flat end mill. This is a V cutter. So these V cutters come to a sharp point. And the number of cutters on there, the number of actual blades on there, are the number of flutes. So you can see here, this is a 2-flute bit, and that's a 4-flute bit. So these are, everyone on this block is a 1/4 inch diameter shaft, and these are all non-bearing router bits, Lexi. Okay, versus this right here. These are also 1/4 inch router bits, but these are bearing. So this bearing on top, the material runs on that bearing. So this is a flush trim router bit. So that pulls the edge flush to either a template that you have, or like when we use the CNC and we clean up that little lip, we're using that flush trim bit. Again, this is 2-flute. These are decorative bits. This is like a Roman OG bit. This cove cutter. This is a T-slot cutter with a bearing. So, I mean, there's whatever design you want, you can find a bit for it. So these are all bearing cutters. These are all non-bearing cutters, and all of them go into a 1/4 inch collet. This right here is your collet. This is what is actually in the router. And you tighten this up. You always use wrenches to tighten it, never pliers. And then it's a compression fitting. So you squeeze these things tighter, and that's what holds the cutter or the router bit in place. Okay. So these are all 1/4 inch. And then right here, this is a really nice set of 1/2 inch router bits. They're mostly dovetails and straight bits. These are all brand new, but you can see how much thicker these shafts are. So it's a 1/2 inch shaft. Use the same router, just a different collet. And the advantage of a really thick shaft like this is you get a lot less deflection and movement, so you get a lot more accurate cuts. Okay. These things are just coated right now with a sealant. As soon as you run them, this will come off. These are all dovetails. These are 5 different dovetails. And then, oh no, that's a dovetail too. And then these are all flat end mills. And again, that's a 2-flute bit. So, like an average price 1/4 inch router bit with the bearings, maybe $20, $30. But they go up to hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. Okay, so out in the shop, really all we have are these handheld routers. And then the tabletop routers is just a handheld router like this, mounted underneath the table with the cutter coming up through the tabletop. And that way, you hold your router stable, the router's held stable in the table, and you move your wood. Or the other way you could do it is you could fix your board. You could fix your board and move your router on the table. So in a router table, the router's mounted up under the table, the router's fixed, you're moving your material. But the way you usually use a handheld router is the material is really well fastened down, and then you're moving the router. They really have an unbelievable amount of torque, so you really have to have a good hand hold on them. On these corded routers, you really want to hold both hands on here. Really conscientious where you're running, and have a good hold. Don't let it get away from you. This little battery operated router here, this is a 1/4 inch 2-flute spiral bit, flat end mill. And my depth of cut, I loosen this up, and then I bring that router bit just through the base. Okay, so it's just showing a little bit. There's a little safety lock on this battery operated one, so you unlock it, and then you turn it on here. And then here's the speed. So you can just slow it down a little bit. And I have a good hold on it. I'm going to plunge in. So with that 1/4 inch flat end mill, you can see it'll pretty much cut anything. How fast is traveling on the board is called the feed rate. How fast you travel down into the board is called the plunge rate. There are 2 different ways to cut with this. Well, I guess there's a million different ways, but there are 2 primary ways. One is called a climb cut, and the other is a conventional cut. So a conventional cut is a cutter spinning this way, and you're feeding into the cutter. A climb cut's the opposite. You're feeding at the same rate that it's spinning, so it wants to climb up the board. Any questions at all on routers so far? So really kind of the first step in all of these things is a handheld router and using it on a fixed board like this. On a construction site, you might have a handrail on a deck. You put a round over bit on it and run it and clean it up. There's really an infinite number of things you could do with the router, from cutting to detailing, to dovetails, to joinery, to different joints. Then once you're really good with a handheld router, then you go to a tabletop router where the router is mounted under the table. And then kind of the third thing, Russell, is that there's a CNC router, and it's still only like a $200 router held on in a gantry, and then the CNC moves it around for you. But all of the ideas of routering are the same, whether you're using a CNC, a tabletop, or using it as a handheld router with your wood fixtures. Here's a short safety sheet here. Make sure you check with me before you use the router. Make sure your stock is always firmly attached. Make adjustments when the electric cord is disconnected. Don't touch any of those cutters unless you have a double lockout. So on these, the cord's disconnected. On the battery one, the battery's pulled out before you reach in and change the cutter. Tighten all bits and cutters with the proper wrenches. Ask me for help with setup. Be sure the switch is in the off position and it's unplugged when you're finished with it. hold that thing firmly. As you turn it up and engage the wood, it's going to want to run, so you need to have a really good firm hold on it. Keep your fingers far from those cutters, and then when you're done, unplug it, clean it up, and put it away. Usually I recess the cutter back up into the base plate so that you can put it down this way. If not, you could put it down sideways, but you don't want to rest it on the cutter. And again, this is a collet. Use a wrench to loosen it. Right, if I'm going to stick my hands in there to loosen the collet, I'm going to pull a battery out or unplug it. And then on this collet, this one has a shaft lock. So you can see right here, you push this button in, and that way you only need one wrench to loosen this up. You can't finger tighten this, you actually have to use a wrench to make sure you have enough torque on it. The big idea on routering, big idea on cutting any wood materials is heat dissipation. And the way you remove heat from your project when you're cutting is you transfer that heat to the chip, and then that chip takes the heat away. So if you actually go way too slow and you're not removing enough dust, then you're going to get too hot. You're going to burn your wood and burn your bit. And you can see on this bit why it's so dull is because it's been burned. Okay, so really go slow. Make sure you have your safety glasses on. That's just a quick overview on routers. Any questions at all? Okay.